Imagine being in a foreign land, hoping for a better future, only to find yourself compelled to leave due to policies, prejudices, or political turmoil. This video uncovers 10 countries that directly or indirectly force Muslims to return to their homelands. From immigration laws to religious intolerance, each nation has unique reasons for this phenomenon. Stay tuned till the end, as we explore the intricate web of policies and challenges faced by Muslims across the globe. But before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. This helps us continue to bring well-researched content like this. Number 1. China. China, a global powerhouse known for its rapid economic growth, is also infamous for its controversial policies regarding minority groups, particularly Muslims. The Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking Muslim minority concentrated in the Xinjiang region, have faced widespread persecution under the guise of countering terrorism and promoting national unity. The Chinese government's policies include mass detentions in what they call re-education camps, surveillance, forced assimilation, and restrictions on religious practices such as fasting during Ramadan or wearing traditional Islamic attire. These measures have drawn international condemnation, with many human rights organizations labeling them as acts of cultural genocide. Uyghur Muslims, who attempt to flee these conditions, often face insurmountable challenges, as China exerts diplomatic pressure on neighboring countries to return refugees. Reports of deportations of Uyghur Muslims back to China from nations like Turkey and Kazakhstan have only added to their plight. The Chinese government maintains that its actions are aimed at combating extremism and fostering stability in the region. However, for many Uyghurs, these policies strip them of their religious and cultural identity, leaving them with little choice but to consider fleeing or returning to oppressive conditions in their homeland. The crackdown has also impacted other Muslim minorities in China, such as Hui Muslims, who face increasing restrictions on religious freedoms. For Muslims in China, the situation is dire, and the international community continues to call for accountability and intervention. The forced return of Uyghurs to China not only underscores the authoritarian grip of the Hui state, but also highlights the lack of safe havens for those seeking to escape persecution. The struggle for survival and dignity remains a harsh reality for Muslims in this region. Number 2. Myanmar. Myanmar, a country rich in culture and history, has garnered global attention for its treatment of the Rohingya Muslim minority, the Rohingya, an ethnic group primarily residing in the Rakhine state, have faced decades of systemic discrimination, violence, and statelessness. In 2017, a brutal military crackdown led to mass killings, sexual violence, and the destruction of villages, forcing over 700,000 Rohingya to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. The Myanmar government has consistently denied the Rohingya citizenship, labeling them as illegal immigrants, despite their centuries-old presence in the country. This lack of legal recognition makes them vulnerable to abuse and prevents them from accessing basic services like education and healthcare. The conditions in Myanmar for those who remain are dire, with reports of forced labor, movement restrictions, and limited access to humanitarian aid. For the Rohingya Muslims, the situation is untenable, leaving many to consider resettling in other countries. Despite the challenges of displacement and uncertainty, international pressure and sanctions have so far done little to improve their plight, making Myanmar one of the most challenging places for Muslims to live and thrive. Number 3. Central African Republic. The Central African Republic, CAR, a landlocked nation in Africa, has been plagued by instability, violence, and ethnic strife for decades. Muslims, who make up a significant minority in the country, have suffered immensely during ongoing conflicts between Christian militias known as anti-Balaka and Muslim-dominated groups like the Salika. What began as a political struggle has devolved into sectarian violence, with Muslims becoming a primary target for attacks, forced displacement, and persecution. In many parts of the country, entire Muslim communities have been wiped out or forced to flee due to anti-Balaka violence. Muslims remaining in the CAR often live in enclaves surrounded by hostile groups, facing limited access to food, healthcare, and freedom of movement. Mosques have been destroyed, and acts of violence, including lynchings, have become alarmingly common. Despite peacekeeping efforts by the United Nations, the situation for Muslims in the CAR remains perilous. The lack of justice and accountability for these atrocities has further entrenched divisions. Many displaced Muslims have fled to neighboring countries like Chad and Cameroon, where they face uncertain futures in overcrowded refugee camps. For those who stay, daily life is a constant struggle for survival in a climate of fear and hostility. The Central African Republic's ongoing crisis highlights the devastating consequences of unchecked sectarian violence. For the Muslim minority, the dream of living in peace and safety remains distant, as the nation struggles to rebuild amid deep-rooted animosities and fragile governance. Number 4. Saudi Arabia. As the birthplace of Islam, Saudi Arabia is central to the Muslim world. However, its rigid interpretation of Sharia law often leaves little room for personal freedoms. Apostasy is punishable by death, creating immense pressure for Muslims to remain devout. For non-Sunni Muslims and expatriates, life in Saudi Arabia is equally challenging. Public practice of non-Islamic faiths is prohibited, and even private gatherings risk severe consequences. This environment, combined with strict surveillance, leaves many Muslims feeling they have no choice but to conform or leave. Saudi Arabia's economic strength and religious influence further reinforce its policies, making it a country where Muslims must adhere to strict guidelines to avoid forced departure. Number 8. Yemen. The crisis in Yemen offers a different perspective. Muslims fleeing Yemen's war-torn landscape often face pressure to return, not from policies, but from circumstances. The ongoing conflict has decimated the country, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. For Yemeni Muslims abroad, the lack of stability, infrastructure, and opportunities back home makes returning a near impossible choice. However, host nations overwhelmed by the refugee influx sometimes push Yemenis to consider the unthinkable, going back to their devastated homeland. The international community's slow response further complicates the situation, leaving displaced Yemenis stuck between a hostile home and uncertain futures abroad. Number 6. Hungary. Hungary, under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, is infamous for its anti-immigration stance, particularly toward Muslims. During the 2015 European refugee crisis, Hungary became a symbol of resistance, constructing border fences and enacting laws to criminalize aiding migrants. Muslim refugees in Hungary face institutional and societal discrimination, with a government actively portraying Muslims as threats to Hungarian culture and Christianity. Settling in the country becomes nearly impossible. Many asylum seekers are denied protection, leaving them with little option but to return to their countries. Despite Hungary's constitutional promise of religious freedom, the hostile political climate overshadows these rights, forcing Muslims to navigate an unwelcoming environment. Number 7. Tajikistan. In Tajikistan, Islam is the dominant religion, yet the government imposes some of the harshest restrictions on religious practices in Central Asia. These measures, aimed at preventing extremism, include surveillance of mosques, bans on children attending religious services, and restrictions on Islamic dress codes. Such policies create an environment where even devout Muslims feel targeted. Deportations, arrests, and harassment of those accused of promoting extremist ideologies are common, though these definitions often blur to include conservative Muslims. For immigrants and returning Tajik Muslims, the country's rigid control over religious expression feels suffocating. Unable to freely practice their faith, many are left with no choice but to seek refuge elsewhere or conform to restrictive state guidelines. Number 8. Turkey. Straddling Europe and Asia, Turkey is a fascinating yet contradictory nation. While 99% of its population identifies as Muslim, government policies sometimes alienate certain Muslim groups, particularly minorities like the Uyghurs. Following an extradition treaty with China, Uyghur Muslims residing in Turkey, Riyadh, fear deportation even as the government publicly denies such intentions. While no large-scale deportations have occurred, the looming threat forces many Uyghurs to reconsider their safety in Turkey. This highlights the precarious position Muslims can find themselves in, even in a Muslim-majority country. Moreover, Turkey's secular roots and state-controlled religious institutions lead to tensions. Imams must adhere to government-approved sermons, and deviations often result in legal action. For Muslims seeking religious freedom, Turkey's balancing act between secular governance and Islamic culture sometimes forces them to look elsewhere. Number 9. Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, a secular Muslim-majority nation at the crossroads of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, might surprise many by its inclusion. Though over 90% of its population practices Islam, the country's strict regulations and pro-secular policies occasionally clash with devout practices. The Azerbaijani government emphasizes religious tolerance, hosting global conferences on multiculturalism and interfaith harmony. However, this facade often masks internal policies targeting Muslims considered too conservative. Restrictions on religious attire, mosque activities, and education make life difficult for practicing Muslims, sometimes pushing them to leave. For Muslim immigrants, the challenge is increased tenfold. Azerbaijan's geopolitical position and Soviet-influenced governance mean that even minor deviations from state-approved religious practices are monitored, leaving many Muslims with no choice but to return to their countries. Number 10. Vatican City. Nestled within the heart of Rome, Vatican City stands as the epicenter of Catholicism. While it's open to visitors of all faiths, including Muslims, its stance on long-term residence is another story. As the smallest country in the world, Vatican City does not grant citizenship or residency to Muslims or most non-Catholics due to its deeply religious governance structure. Despite its exclusivity, the Vatican fosters interfaith dialogue. Events encouraging cooperation among Muslims and Christians showcase its unique approach to religious diplomacy. However, these initiatives often lack the depth to support Muslims seeking a permanent home within its walls. The city-state's limited resources and singular focus on preserving Catholic traditions make it challenging for non-Catholics to establish roots. For many Muslims, Vatican City remains a symbol of religious openness, but also a reminder of the barriers between faiths. Its policies might not explicitly force Muslims to leave, but the unavailability of residency or citizenship makes it impossible for them to stay long-term.